Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. Anna, welcome to Montclair.
Thank you. Welcome back to Montclair. I've been in this majestic setting several times before.
Well, I had the honor of interviewing you in May of 2016. Can everybody hear us? When Anna's last book, or 2 books ago, came out in May of 2016, we chatted in the auditorium at a middle school that at the time was called Mount Hebron. It's now called Buzz Aldrin. A lot has changed in the past 6 years, and I went back and looked at my list of questions to see what I asked you back then and to make sure I didn't repeat anything, not that you would really remember probably. But I was sort of mortified when I realized that the last question that I asked you 6 years ago was, are you excited to have the first woman president in the White House? And I remember you gave me sort of an appalled look and said, this is not a done deal. And later I was like, Anna Quindlen's kind of negative. So I thought we could just start I'd love for you to tell us what the last 6 years have been like for you.
Oh my goodness.
Where to begin?
Well, the challenging part is my essential nature is optimistic. I've been finding all of the ways to let people that I love and that I know and that I interact with know about the mitigating factors, for example, if Roe is overturned. I want to be the person to say, the house is not necessarily on fire yet. Here's what might change. But it's been harder to be that person for the last 6 years than at any time. I mean, what was it that the president said at the White House Correspondents' Dinner? We had a plague and then we had COVID. And I sort of thought that summed it up. I mean, the Hillary thing was just devastating for me, for all of us, and almost unthinkable. And I remember very well the maybe 2 months between that election night in 2016 and the inauguration, when those of us who did tend to be somewhat optimistic kept saying, people always run as some cartoon version of themselves. It won't be as bad as we think it's going to be. And it took maybe a month before we all went, oh, it's much worse than we thought it was going to be. And then, of course, COVID struck, and we're just now, as readers keep telling me at events like this, just now beginning to show our faces in the public square again. I still am trying to be essentially optimistic. When things get really tough, I say, the Affordable Care Act. And it makes me feel better for a few minutes. But it's definitely been a uniquely challenging time in the history of this country.
To say the least.
Yes.
Well, in your new book, you write about how writing creates a time capsule that we can look back on. I think there are aspects of this time we may never want to look back on. But tell us a little bit, for the people in the room maybe who don't consider themselves writers, tell us a little bit about what you mean by that idea that writing is something, sort of a trail of breadcrumbs that you leave for the people who come after you.
Well, let me be clear. This book is called Write for Your Life. It is not a book about writing for writers. There are plenty of those out there. We don't, in my opinion, we don't necessarily need another one, or I didn't necessarily need to write that. This is a book for what I refer to as civilians, people who don't think of themselves as writers. So we have at our fingertips something that data has shown us lessens stress, lessens anxiety, promotes connections. All three things that we consider societal ills now, and we're not using it. We're not using it. Maybe we convince ourselves that we've used it because we've written 20 emails in a given day and sent off 20 texts. But we're not doing the kind of thoughtful, discursive writing that can help us feel better about ourselves and our lives. And we're also not doing the kind of thoughtful, discursive writing that will bring to generations to come not only a powerful, intimate sense of ourselves. Oh my God, this is what my grandmother was like. This is so interesting to me. But a granular sense of our own history. We've all begun to criticize the history of this country because it seems to be a history created entirely by prosperous and powerful white men about great events. And the truth of the matter is, to me at least, what real history feels like is how ordinary people live day to day. The only way that we have that kind of history of the lives of women, history of the lives of immigrants, of people of color, is if we write it. And one of the things that was really distressing to me when I was pulling this book together in advance of COVID generally, was that in the book is a letter from a nurse talking about taking care of service members in a hospital in Washington, D.C., and how destabilizing it is for her when the first one that she's taking care of dies. It's during a pandemic. Everything's closed, except that it's during the 1918 flu pandemic. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, I hope somewhere there are nurses taking care of patients during the COVID pandemic so that 100 years from now, we will know what it's like. But given our aversion to writing letters, to keeping journals, our false sense that the new technologies allow us to write in ways that are enduring, which I don't think is true, I worry that we won't have that. And we need that. So we need that, and generations to come need that.
And in the early days of the lockdown in March of 2020, I kept telling my kids, I can't tell you when you'll go back to school. I can't tell you if, your dance performance will be canceled or, whatever incredibly important thing they were looking forward to would ever spring back to life. But I kept saying to them, the only thing I know is if you're lucky enough to have grandchildren, they will ask you about this time. Write about it. Get out your notebook and write what we're doing here in this house right now. And of course, the reaction was not terribly positive. And it led me to wonder, why do you think people who aren't musicians might be inclined to pick up a guitar and strum it? People who are not dancers go to weddings and get out on the dance floor and dance. Why do people have this fear of writing when it is just another art form and another way of expressing yourself, and also at the most simple level, a hobby?
It's intimidating. And one of the things that I really wanted to communicate in this book is that it is intimidating for me. That there is not a single morning when I sit down to write when I don't think to myself, you are not good at this. This will not be good. This will not be worth reading. Nobody's going to care about this. What are you thinking? And I have to wrestle that to the ground every morning before I begin. Now, I have to wrestle it to the ground every morning because, as I say glibly sometimes when I'm being kind of a smart aleck, mortgage got to get paid because this is what I do for a living. If I didn't have to do that, I would be swamped by the insecurities. And that's the thing about writing. I think that it's about so much more than putting words together. It's really about confidence. It's really about saying, I have something to say, and you should pay attention to it. And people are put off by the idea of doing that. They recoil from the idea of doing that. And also, I think I mean, I say in the book, and it's really sad to me, there's so much less writing going on in schools than there once was. So much less discursive, creative writing, which admittedly, first of all, is not going to be tested on the mandated tests. Second of all, may not be built into the state mandated curriculum, certainly is not built into the Common Core. And also it's hard to assess. You know, I mean, any given person will tell you either that The Sound and the Fury is an act of Faulkner's genius or it's an impenetrable mess. So you hand that to your average teacher and say, okay, is this an A or an F? And the question is a question of taste.
Right.
But I did by inches become a writer in schools. I did by inches doing discursive writing that was praised by teachers. As I say in the book, I am a writer because of teachers. I really am. And I would love it if we could bring more writing back into schools, in part because, as I said, there's all these documented cases in which it alleviates stress. I mean, when you do a nonfiction book, it is axiomatic that when you're done the book and someone reads it, they will give you a piece of information that you so wish you had had when you were writing the book. You almost want to flip through and go, okay, we'll stick it in here. The president of Barnard is a psychologist named Sian Bylock. And she told me about a study that she did of a group of students who had a high level of anxiety about a math test. So they they divide the group of students into two groups. One group goes off and studies for the math test. The other group sits down and writes about it. Why are they feeling so stressed out? How is the stress manifesting itself? What is it about this particular test? And unequivocally, the group that writes about it does better on the math test. Hello, boom. That's the, you know, if writing can do that for students, we've got to have them doing more of it. If writing can make them have less stress, if writing can make them have more of an insight into themselves, well, you know, you just got to do it. And it's important that kids particularly understand that if they're writing and it's challenging for them, it's hard for them, they're not getting it right, their teacher tells them it needs to be rewritten, that does not mean they're not writers. I think there's a tendency for not only kids, but sort of for Americans to think, I mean, how many times have I been told, you're a natural, you must be a natural, you must be a natural, right? And I think, oh no. You know, it's hard to write and it's challenging. And I do a lot of rewriting. And as the old saw says, I hate writing, but I love having written. And I hope I can communicate that especially to kids.
I wish there was more of a track for, say, there are the kids who devote themselves to sports and that's maybe their thing. I wish there was more of a chance for kids to realize you can be a casual runner but not be on the cross-country team. You can be a casual writer and just do it as a hobby, something that's fun that you do for yourself, a sort of a practice of sorts that helps you connect with a side of yourself that isn't getting graded, that isn't for the SAT, that isn't the dreaded 5-paragraph essay that ends with in conclusion. And I think I worry that in the current world that the fun of it, the experimenting with writing a sestina, writing haiku, it's not something at least my kids have done here in the wonderful schools of Montclair. Do you have a writing practice? Like I'm not somebody who has a yoga practice, but I know that there are people who wake up and do their downward dog every morning. Do you have a writing practice like that?
You mean, do I write every day?
Yes.
Allegedly? No, I mean, most days I do. I am not to use your yoga analogy, I am not what you would call a flexible person in a lot of ways. So I have two offices. One is in my house in the city, one is in my house in the country. Both of those offices have big desks on them. Both of them have MacBook Airs on them. And I have a kid who's a young adult novelist, and he's the guy who will take the train into the city and have his MacBook Air out and write on the train. And then in the middle of dinner will say, I'll be back in about an hour, and run upstairs and write. And I just don't understand where that comes from. I have to be at my desk, at my computer. It has to be morning, 9 o'clock, 9:30, something like that. Couple hours, slug it out and everything. So I'm pretty regimented that way. That's what works for me. And then eventually, I wind up with a first draft of a book. I just finished the first draft of a novel, but don't tell my editor or my agent because I haven't told them yet. And I want to hold off as long as possible. And when I'm finished a draft, I read the whole book out loud because my eye will forgive things that my ear won't. I can go right over a sentence and think, oh, that's not too long. And then when I read it out loud and I can't breathe at the end, I realize it needs a semicolon, which, as you know, is the New York Times punctuation of choice.
Love a semicolon. Or an M dash.
Or, you hear the clunks in a sentence that needs to be more rhythmic. You hear dialogue that doesn't sound like real people talk. So I do that, and then I give it to my editor, and then she gives it back to me, and I have to, unfortunately, do revisions. I live for the day when I will be told that my first draft is perfect and I shouldn't change a thing. But I'll be 70 in July, and so far it hasn't happened, and this is book 21. So
You'll get there.
I think I'm cooked.
Every time I sit down to write anything, I think of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And I think there are these stages, the Elisabeth Egan, also with an S, stages of writing, which are fear, loathing, anger,
denial,
distraction, denial, hunger is a big one. You have to have a snack. Then you have to have more coffee. Then maybe your dog needs a walk. How do you push through the Anna Quindlen stages of dread?
You just described exactly what happens every day. I mean, on a good day, you don't have to push through them. The good day, the reason you keep doing this is because you sit down at the computer. So I have this little trick that I play on myself because of the insecurity of the morning, which is I never end at the end of a chapter. I never end at the end of a day at the end of a chapter. I never end at the end of a paragraph. And I never end at the end of a sentence. I end halfway through a sentence. Because even on my worst days, I can finish a sentence that I've already started. And that usually leads to another and another. And you're sitting there and you start to type. And then there are those rare days where you start to type and you're typing really fast. And you look up and an hour has gone by. And you realize
it's a miracle.
You're in the zone. You're in that fugue state, and man, that keeps the whole thing going, But the rest of the time, you sort of dither around. You write a couple paragraphs, and you're like, "Yeah, that's okay, but my coffee's cold," Or a text pops up on your screen, and you think, "Don't read the text," and then you read the text,
Yeah.
There is a fair amount of dithering that goes on, but then there are just those moments where you just keep on because with a novel, you're in the world. You're in the world and you're not coming out of the world for a while.
Who do you have kind of sitting on your shoulder, the good voice on your shoulder? Who are you writing for? I still am thinking of my 7th grade English teacher. I'm 48 years old. I haven't seen her since I was probably 17. She is still the person. Every word I write, I think about her. And I wonder if you have somebody like
If
that.
any of you are teachers,
Yeah.
you should just keep in mind that you are the most powerful people on earth, because both of us are up here, obviously, because some
Yeah.
teacher told us this was good. I mean, there's no question about that for me. There's three main ones, but endless varieties. I can't really do that, Liz, anymore because when I was a columnist at the Times, particularly, well, it was somewhat true of life in the 30s. It was very true of public and private, the op-ed page column. I would realize that if I tried to envision an audience, I would just be doing 0.5%. I mean, there were older and veteran Times readers who would write to me. There were young mothers who were trying to fit my column in because they thought we were in the same wheelhouse. There were people in great power in Washington, and there were people who felt powerless and who felt empowered by the column. So it was an audience so vast that it took away my ability to think of an audience. So I basically write for myself. At the same time, it was really interesting. I was doing an event with Megan O'Rourke, who has written this genius book called The Invisible Kingdom about chronic illness and why medicine can't deal with it. Really a good book. Megan's also a poet, and she said that when she's writing prose, she thinks of the reader on the other side of the computer screen. But when she's writing poetry, she doesn't care about the reader. She's only writing for herself. And I thought that was such an interesting dichotomy. So I do think in general, when I'm writing, that I'm having a dialogue with someone who I can't see, but I can't really personify that person. All I know is if it evokes certain things in me, then I have to be confident that I have that connection. Robert Frost once said, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader." And I thought that was really a powerful evocation of something I feel, which is when I'm working on a novel and I feel moved by something that's in it, I think I'm making a connection here, and that connection at this moment feels like it's only with myself, but I've got to trust that it will be with other people as well.
At what point do you know that something you've written is ready to share with other people, and does that moment change according to whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction?
It's the end of that read-through. I always know where my novels are going, but I'm always surprised when I get there. There's a moment where I'm sitting at the computer typing, and I write a sentence, and almost with a sound like a door slamming, I think, oh my God, that's the last sentence. And it always comes as a bit of a surprise to me that is, in fact, the last sentence. Then I go back and do the read-through, and then basically I give it up. And I really hate giving it up. I sometimes say facetiously that I would love to be able to be a writer and never have anybody read my writing. And maybe someday that's what'll happen, and then the mortgage won't get paid. I just feel like when I'm done that, I have to give it up, in part because, and you've probably had this experience too, by the time you finish even a longish magazine piece, but certainly a book, you're so in the weeds with it that if somebody said to you, gee, you left out X, you'd go, oh gosh, that's right. There's a whole section there that I should have had in, that because you're living in the world of the book, and you've lost that 30,000 feet perspective. You're walking around in it as opposed to looking down on it, which is what my editor does.
Have you ever gotten very, very far into a project and walked away from it? Do you have any novels in a drawer?
I haven't gotten very, very far away and walked away from it. I have an entire first draft of a novel that both my editor and my agent, for the same reason, found unpersuasive. I honestly am still not sure that I agree with them. and I will probably revisit it after I do the revisions on the novel I plan to hand in the next week or two.
I loved your description in the book of putting together collections of your complete works for each one of your kids. And it made me wonder about regret. Do you ever look at all the spines of your books, or even at the, think back on your columns and do you have least favorite things? Do you have published work that you wish you could retract?
No. Honestly.
You weren't raised as Catholic as I was.
I was a little girl who grew up. All the writers I loved most were male, English, and dead. And it was initially, I'm pretty sure, mainly because of Little Women, that I began to think I could do this. Because in Little Women, Jo wants to be a writer. Jo's entire family thinks she will be a writer. And because you're holding the book in your hand, you know that Jo has in fact become a writer. I think the best movie version of Little Women is the most recent one made by Greta Gerwig, and there's a moment at the end where they're making Jo's book, where they're actually sewing the covers and putting it together. Everybody else cries when Beth dies. I cry when they're putting that book together. I mean, I just think that scene is just astonishing. So the idea that I could do this, that it could be on the shelves, it was this incredible fantasy. And so honestly, when I look at my bookshelf, I mean, Martin Amis once said to Salman Rushdie something like, the point is to be able to say, from here to here, that's me. And for me to look at my shelves, which are very untidy, but to say, that's me, it's like a miracle to me. It's like a miracle to me. And I sometimes feel like the luckiest woman on earth.
I love that answer. I have wondered so many times over the past 6 years about your thoughts on so many stories in the news. And I know that you have editors calling and asking you to write about things. I think I've been that editor a few times. How have you shown such tremendous restraint in not picking up the opinion column thread again? Or has it not been restraint and just self-preservation?
Oh, I think when you walk away from a big job, you've got to leave the party. I think it's really bad form to hang around. I was chair of a board for 8 years, and afterwards they made me chair emerita, which made me sound like I was a million years old. And I haven't been to a board meeting since, because I think having the previous board chair hanging around is a disservice to the current board chair. And I think having the previous opinion columnist who left after only 5 years buzz in and out, that's unseemly. But the other thing is, and I think what people don't get until they're actually doing it, is being an opinion columnist is kind of a 24/7 thing. Not so much because you're writing all the time or even reporting all the time, but because of the way your mind is turned on. You don't approach anything from a traffic jam to an evening meal to a press conference in Washington without that switch turned on. Everything becomes grist for the mill, whether you use it or not. I remember the first year that I watched the State of the Union without a reporter's notebook on my lap. And there was some cognitive dissonance. But once you've turned that switch off, you're not really ready to go into the arena again. And I suppose I could have. And honestly, there was one. I was asked to write a very long piece, and did, about what it meant to have the first woman president of the United States. And it's still on my hard drive. And obviously, it never saw the light of day. I felt like that was a moment that was important enough, and I was grounded enough both in American politics and in second wave feminism to write something meaningful about that. And so it was particularly heartbreaking to realize that I had decided one more time to go around and wouldn't have the opportunity. Of course, that was a small heartbreak for one opinion writer, an enormous disaster for the United States of America.
To a more to an easier subject, you mentioned that you weren't thinking of Write for Your Life as a book for writers necessarily. It's for civilians, which is, I think, a huge part of its appeal. I remember as a kid, probably in middle school, reading One Writer's Beginnings and reading A Writer's Life by Annie Dillard, and a little flashbulb going off, even though nobody in my family was a writer, I didn't have any model for becoming a writer. We were sort of encouraged to become nurses or teachers. And I'm wondering what those books were for you, and even if they weren't about the writing life, what were the books that you read that sparked that little note of recognition?
Well, it was definitely Little Women. The Betsy Tacy books by Maud Hart Lovelace. Betsy also becomes a writer. The fantastic series of books that many people have never even heard of, but are invaluable because they start when Betsy and Tacy are in kindergarten and they go up through Betsy's wedding. And they're fantastic books. And Anne of Green Gables. So,
did you read the Emily Newmoon ones also?
No.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I also loved Anne Shirley, but L.M. Montgomery wrote another series called Emily of New Moon that I think is even better. It might be worth investigating.
Okay.
Emily becomes a writer also.
Those books where girls became writers are just so powerful. But notice that they're all books set in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. There weren't a whole lot of books about girls who became writers in 1930 and 1940. I remember when I first discovered Dorothy Thompson, when I read a book called Dorothy in Red, which I only wanted to read because Red was Sinclair Lewis, and I love Main Street. And then Dorothy Thompson was the most powerful columnist in the world, really, in the 40s and part of the 50s. And I remember stumbling upon that and saying, women can do this. It was a huge role model moment for me when I first met her and became even more of one. Someone gave me a very old book called The Columnist that had a whole section about her when I got the op-ed page column. And I really felt like I was hoping she was looking over my shoulder.
I'm sure she was. How do you know when you're finished with a book what the next book will be? You said you've just finished a novel, which I can't wait to read. How do you know what comes next?
There's usually something rocking around in my head by the time I'm finished the rewrites on a book. Write for Your Life has been something I've been saving string on for years and years and years because of that feeling that we weren't using writing in the ways that we could in the United States. And I kept coming up against things that I added to my file for this book. So I decided to write it because in the middle of COVID, I read a piece that said that stationery stores were having this huge boom in journals. that people were really turning towards journals during this time. And then I found out about this thing called Penpalooza, which Rachel Syme from the New Yorker started, where she went on Twitter and said, does anybody want a pen pal? And pretty soon she had thousands of people. And I had already started work on the book, and I thought, well, this is the right book to bring out at this moment. But usually when I'm doing the revisions on a novel, characters start to present themselves, and the next thing I know, I'm champing at the bit a little bit to get to the next one.
What is your best advice for somebody sitting here in this room right now who is toiling away on some kind of maybe secret long writing project that they feel insecure about or even hopeless about?
Oh, well, nobody should feel hopeless about their writing. First of all, there's a great quote from Jacques Barzun where he says something about how you should imagine that you're writing in clay and not in marble. And you know, when you write something down, I was doing a podcast with Amy Bloom, the wonderful writer who has a wonderful new book called In Love that I recommend to everyone. And Amy said, you know, I got to the point where I just thought, well, no one's seeing this but me. And now, eventually, you know, thousands of people saw it because it was edited and published and so on and so forth. But on any given day, no one's seeing it but me. I'm sympathetic to the angst because for the first, I think it was the first 4, I can't remember, but I used to refer to it as the long thing. And my kids were like, yeah, that's what she calls a novel. Because if she calls it a novel, like, it's serious. But if she calls it a long thing, then it's not as serious. And eventually I started to call it a novel, too, when I was working on it. But I think you can't despair. And you've got to remember that there are lots of people out there who have written quietly things that they've despaired about, that have spoken to thousands of people. I mean, you know, the reason I begin with The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank is because Anne Frank wasn't writing a book that would sell millions and millions of copies in dozens of languages. She was talking to herself. She gave her diary a name. She called it Kitty. She said, I'm going to be able to talk to you in a way that I can't talk to anybody else. And that idea that the writing serves first and foremost you, to have that kind of connection, and then could potentially have a connection with untold numbers of people over untold numbers of generations. I mean, that's what writing can sometimes do.
And that's we risk losing that, as you said, with everybody, you know, posting the thoughts they might have put in a diary are now on Twitter, or are just kind of disappearing into the ether. Not to be a complete Luddite, but I think about that also.
I'm not a Luddite, but I picture after I'm dead, my children going through my email. Oh, so she returned that sweater to Hallsbrook. Okay, she returned that sweater. Oh, she had the septic tank pumped. Oh, it would take them months to find anything of any moment in there. And one doctor writer who is included in the book said, well, that's ridiculous. You can save it as a PDF and print it out. But I don't think most people do that. No. I think, you know, if my children, I mean, I'm very lucky my children will be able to find me in one of many books. But it would also be nice for them and for all of our children to sit down at a desk, open a drawer, and find an envelope with a letter inside. It doesn't have to be a long letter. It doesn't have to necessarily be that discursive. But if you wrote it by hand, then they would really feel like their mother or their father was there. Mm-hmm. There's something about seeing the handwriting of someone you love that says they lived. And I think we're losing that too. And I hope in some small way, not in an overarching way. I mean, nobody's going to write letters anymore saying, could you come to luncheon in 3 weeks? No, that's a text, you know. But if you want to, if it's your best friend's 50th birthday, it might be an opportunity to sit down and write about what she's meant to you. And at the bottom, sign Liz, you know,
Yeah.
so that 20 years from now she can pull it out of the drawer and say, this meant so much to me.
I could not agree more, and I'm a huge believer in cards and just not just writing love Liz, you know, in the birthday
Yeah.
card. And there was a real low moment in my marriage several years ago where on Valentine's Day I bought a very beautiful vellum wrapped Valentine for my husband. You know, sometimes a Valentine can cost like it was like $8 at Watch Young Books, and I never had time to fill it out. And so on Valentine's Day night, I handed it to my husband. I said, "Happy Valentine's Day." I was so busy, I did not have time to write anything in this card, and that is all you need to know about our phase of life right now. And I've cleaned up my act since then. But I loved what you said in the book when you wrote about keeping a paper calendar, how a calendar can also work as a parallel.
Parallel charts.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm very surprised by how responsive people have been to the chapter in the book, which is about doctors and nurses using writing as a way, basically, to kind of stay sane. And it's a real thing, and it's a growing thing. And this doctor at Columbia Presbyterian, who also has a PhD in English literature, Rita Sharon, came up with this program called Parallel Charts, third-year medical students. So you have your regular chart that has blood pressure and sex and, you know, description of the condition and so on. And then the parallel chart is what you know about the patient, but that you wouldn't write in your standard chart. And it's a way of, first of all, getting doctors to write, and second of all, getting them to connect with their humanity and the humanity of their patients. And as she was talking to me about parallel charts, I thought we could all do that with some aspect of our life. So if you're writing down doctor's appointment 10 o'clock, May 2nd, you could, if you had another calendar, you could write, I had a bad mammogram 2 weeks ago, and they're looking at it again, and all I can think about is whatever, 2 or 3 sentences, but it's the fact that the bare bones of our lives have another side to them that we can sometimes lose and forget about. So 20 years hence, you look at that doctor's appointment, and you have no idea what you went to the doctor for. But if you looked at the parallel chart, you would think, oh, that was one of the scariest doctor's visits I ever had.
I do a thing every Sunday night where I go back into my paper calendar and I fill in basically everything that happened that week. So if I said lunch with Anna, I will go in and say where we ate, or I write down what I was reading that week, or maybe some news event that was happening that was important to me that week. And I always wonder, will anybody ever look at this, you know, other than me someday? Probably not, but to me, it's a really useful. I could tell you going back 30 years what I was doing on May 8th or whatever the date is.
But I think
there's
it's
a creative act to it.
It's also important to realize that sometimes you write for readers. Sometimes you write for one reader when you're writing a letter, and sometimes you write for yourself, because there's something about putting something down that makes you look at it and say, it makes it both bigger and smaller at the same time, which is kind of amazing. So you put something down and think, this was a real thing in my life, but it doesn't have the kind of power that it had when it was just ricocheting around in my brain. And it's particularly true about things that are stressing you out, you know, that there's something about writing them down that takes away a little bit of their power and makes them a little more palatable. And to the extent that that's only for you, I think that that's really useful.
And to just say, I was here.
Yeah.
I lived. I did
Yes.
this.
Yes. Yes.
I wonder if we have time for a few questions from the audience. Does anyone have? I see somebody in the blue sweater.
Oh, I think they have a microphone
wow.
for
Okay,
you.
good.
This is this is the most beautiful setting, and for a Catholic, it's astonishing that anyone lets me in here. But your voice sort of goes right up.
Hi, thank you so much. I actually have two questions if I'm allowed. Feel free to answer only one if you don't like the both of them. The first one is about the future of the long form, because I was fascinated in how you were talking about the Luddite perspective. I actually think it's kind of a resurrection of writing with the texts and emails, perhaps not the type of literary writing that we are used to, but thinking back to the 18th century, letter novels. What's to you the future of the long form? Because obviously there's a long discussion about the end of the novel, and so what to you is the future of that long thing that you are referring to in modern times?
I hope that there's a robust future for the long form, which has been with us for centuries. Let's go back to Tristram Shandy and go forward to Don DeLillo. And I do think, one of the points I make in the book is, there was a period where all of our communication was in writing. So if you wanted to have any kind of communication with another person, you sent them a letter. Then we had what I call the telephone interregnum. What we have now is better than the telephone interregnum, because during the telephone interregnum, everything went into the ether.
Yeah.
At least you can go into my emails now and find the emails I sent. Telephone interregnum, it's all gone. But I do think there's a little bit of fooling ourselves that we've done writing when what we've done is texting and emailing, and that they're so evanescent that they don't count in quite the same way as the long form, which I hope will continue to exist.
Thank you for this. And my second question is about the relationship between writing and motherhood, which you don't hear about because, to your point, there isn't a lot, there aren't even a lot of women novelists. And since you made a reference to that, I'm curious if you have a perspective to share.
Yes, I do.
If motherhood, does the living and the mothering take you away from writing? And does the writing take away from the mothering and the living? Or does it make you a better mother in some form?
I was at a dinner one night sitting next to Grace Paley, which is still a sentence I can't believe I get to utter. And Grace Paley turned to me, I forget who we were discussing, and she said, Anna, how much more prolific we would have been had we not had children. And I knew exactly what she meant, but what I wanted to say back was how much less interesting our work would have been had we not have children. I think having children made me a much better writer because it made me reconnect with the world and with the wonders of the world in a way that's only good for a writer in general and for a novelist specifically. Having said that, I mean, I talked about my writing practice and I go upstairs and everything. I mean, I basically write during school hours. My children are in their 30s now, but I write during school hours because that's how I used to have to write. If somebody had an ear infection, my writing practice went right out the window. So there's no question that it interfered from time to time with my work as a writer. But I think it enriched it too so much that I just thank the heavens for it. And I think most of the writers whose work I am most connected to at this point tend to be female, and most of them tend to have Alice McDermott, I think, is just an astonishing writer at this point. Amy Bloom, Alice Munro, Marilyn Robinson. I think women are doing exceptionally good and morally and psychologically acute work, and that some of that arises out of being what is still in lots of ways an oppressed class, and also arises out of their work with their children. I think we got another one.
I'm not sure I'll need this, Anna, but okay. It's just something that I picked up along the way, even though I'm a journalist, not of the esteem, obviously, that you have, but I do take pride in my writing. And the one thing that I got along the way that's helped me, and I can't remember was from a teacher or from what I read or what have you, but it's always served me the best. I was wondering what you felt about it. Write the way you speak. Write the way you speak. I can remember back in my freshman year at college, and I got a first D+ in my English 101. I went in to see the grad student. He said, write clear, coherent, and succinct. And the reason I'm going off on this tangent is because when you mentioned during your presentation that the punctuation of choice at the New York Times was semicolon, and that's my paper of choice, and I guess this is more of a question of the state of journalism today. I mean, it's so important. It's just so important to get the right message, to get the facts out, to get, the news out, so on and so forth. But even the New York Times, they just get bogged down, in long sentences that you're going to go to fall asleep on before you finish the lead. I just wanted to know what your opinion is, the current state of writing is in terms of journalism.
I'm really high on journalism, and I'm really high on the New York Times, and I will be until the day I die. I always feel like carping about the New York Times is a little like listing Meryl Streep's less good performances. I mean, I still think the Times is the gold standard, and I think you only have to look at it in the last week. They have done a spectacular job on the leaked Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade, and they're still doing a spectacular job on the war in Ukraine. At some level, I feel like nobody does it better. But I have to say, as per what you said, there's a short chapter in this book about voice. I mean, once you've read Anna Karenina, and you've read Bleak House, and you've read The Sound and the Fury and The Age of Innocence, you realize that nobody ever really needs to write another novel. The only reason to keep on writing is because you have one thing that nobody else has ever had, and that is your particular voice, which is highly individual. Now, I don't mean your voice, I have a casual voice, right? And on the page, my voice gets cleaned up, but it's undeniably my voice. You can read stuff that I wrote when I was 16, and I will be so embarrassed by it, and you can feel that voice inside it, and it's the same voice that wrote this book. So I think it's really important to communicate that to students, because they feel like can't be like your voice. It has to be like some superannuated, really, really intelligent, polysyllabic word voice. And you're like, no, there actually are people who have that voice. God bless them. Let them go with it. You need to bring your voice to the table, because we've never exactly heard your voice before. And I think that's so critical to communicate to students.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Liz. Come on.
Thank you all for coming.